I am Matthew Facciani. I am the last hour between lunch, so we'll make it through it. We're almost there. I'm super excited to be here today. So I'll be talking about science communication and using some AI strategies, as well as how to have productive dialogue. So my background is actually in the social sciences, but I work in a computer science department here at the University of Notre Dame. So this conference is super cool for me personally because it's a conference kind of built around my interdisciplinary background as well. So today I'll be first talking about identities and how they influence information processing, and also how to have productive dialogue. Then I'll be talking about building trust while navigating media as well as social media. And finally, I'm going to be playing around with ChatGPT for some strategies where we could potentially use it to help us with science communication. So first off, when I talk about identities, what do I even mean by that? Well, there's this sociological definition that it breaks down to three distinct components I think are important. So we can think of identities as a set of meanings that defines individuals in terms of the roles they occupy, the social categories or groups they belong to, or individual characteristics that define them as unique persons. So we can have a scientist identity, we can have a sports fan identity, or we can think of ourselves as a curious person. That's our own individual identity. And these are important because they influence our beliefs and behavior. There's this identity feedback loop where we have a motivation to maintain consistency between the values and meanings of our identities, as well as the environments that we find ourselves in. So these identities actually give us a lot of self-esteem. They give us this boost whenever we behave in ways that are consistent with those identities. So if we're a scientist and we do good research, that might make us feel good. If our sports team wins, that also might make us feel good. And if we're a curious person and we learn something new, again, that gives us a nice self-esteem boost. Now, this can be an issue sometimes whenever we want to support our important identities. But let's say we have a political identity that can bias us to interpret the world in a way that maybe is not consistent with the best evidence available. So we're biased to support our political team, and maybe our political team has a biased interpretation of different information. So this creates this susceptibility to misinformation because we are motivated, again, to protect our identities and process information in a way that is consistent with that identity. So both Democrats and Republicans have this motivation. There's a lot of research looking at how they both have a proclivity to process information in a way that's consistent with the values of their respected groups. This is something that I've done research on. And this also intersects with networks. So it's not just a static identity, but also how identities interact with other people who share those identities as well. So when we think about misinformation, the basic definition is just false or misleading information. And again, when we think about political identities, this can bias us to support our own group while attacking outgroups. And I'll be focusing on political identities here mostly because they're very easy to study from a social science perspective. So in the United States, we have these two major political groups. There's an in-group and an out-group. They generally don't like each other, and they both process information very differently. But importantly, when I talk about these identity processes, this applies to identities broadly. So when we have very strong, important identities, we have this motivation to protect them and behave in ways that are consistent with the meanings associated with that identity. So going back to political identities, you've probably seen charts like this where over time, political polarization has grown in the United States between Democrats and Republicans. It's not just ideological polarization, but both Democrats and Republicans, they really don't like each other. And you can see this chart over the last few decades, there's a decrease in the warmth they feel to the opposing political group. And we see the results of this, unfortunately, through a lot of different very important issues today. One, there's a stark difference in how Democrats and Republicans view the legitimacy of elections. We saw this with COVID-19, that Democrats and Republicans viewed the severity of the virus quite differently right from the beginning. And one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans agree on is actually that they agree that they can't agree on basic facts. So it causes a lot of problems. It's very difficult to get through to people who see the world very differently than we might. And I think when we consider the factors of identity, one way we can learn about identities in a way that can break down this polarization and susceptibility to misinformation is considering this concept of social identity complexity. So all that means is whenever we have more identities that are more independent from each other, so they don't overlap very much. And I'll go through a few examples of this. But basically, higher social identity complexity means you have more identities that are more independent from each other. And when people have this, they're more open-minded, they have greater tolerance for outgroups, they're less susceptible to misinformation. And again, the converse of this is whenever all of our identities overlap very easily. And this creates a vulnerability for bias. So when we think about political identities, again, one reason why American political identities are so impactful for how we process the world is because you can think about American political identities as mega identities. This is something that a few political scientists have referred to American political identities as mega identities because so many of their identities within the political identities overlap with other types of identities. So if you just know someone is a Democrat or Republican, you can predict what part of the world they live in, their religion, lots of different attitudes towards different topics, all from just one category. So when we think about this, if all of our identities are overlapping with each other in a narrow lens, then we're more vulnerable to misinformation because we're deriving so much of our self-esteem from a smaller set of meanings. So let's say we have a religious identity and a political identity, and they overlap completely. So this is an extreme example of low social identity complexity, because let's say there's no overlap, and everyone you know from your political group and your religious group, they're all together. In fact, you volunteer at your church, and all of your friends are there, and it's a complete circle over how you view the world. This makes you more vulnerable to bias because you're deriving so much of your self-esteem and your self-worth from a narrow set of meanings. So any information that conflicts with those narrow set of meanings attacks your entire sense of self. Conversely, let's say we have a political identity and a religious identity, but they're not that connected. They have some overlap, but not a lot of overlap. And let's say we volunteer, but not at our church, but at a pet shelter. So again, pretty different, not connected. And we have friends, our friend identity, but they're not connected to any of these other identities. This is a much broader social identity complexity that allows us to derive self-esteem from many different sources, so we're not vulnerable to any one source having a big impact on us. So to illustrate this for myself, so one of my identities is being a friend, but I'm also the captain of my softball team. And when we think about these identities, we can think about the connections, but we can also think about conflicts. So for example, if one of my friends is on my softball team and they're not playing very well, then I have the conflict of wanting to bench them or put them lower in the batting order, even though they're still my friend. So when we think about how our identities connect with each other, it's not also how they share meanings and how they're connected, but also when those come into conflict with each other as well. Other identities that I have include being a teacher, being a researcher, and these are connected and share different meanings with my academic identities, but they're far away from my softball captain identities. So they're very different sources of self-esteem. I've also volunteered for different organizations, and I also see myself as a curious person. This curiosity identity is then more connected to the teaching and researcher identities. So I think thinking about our identity maps is important because it allows us to reflect on where we derive our own self-esteem from, as well as whenever we're interacting with someone else, and we can consider where they're deriving their self-esteem from. So I'd like to take the next 60 seconds or so for us to write down just a quick identity map of ourselves. So if you have a piece of paper in front of you, or a phone, or a laptop, try to just think about different important meanings that you have, and then connect them spatially on the piece of paper or on your Word document, the ones that are closer together and share meanings, and then put the ones that are not as connected to each other, put them a little bit further apart to give you a representation of where your identities are on this map and what types of social identity complexity you might have. All right, I see some maps being drawn. So this is a useful exercise, and there's some political scientists and practitioners who recommend this as a tool to reduce polarization between different groups. And I think it's really useful because it really makes us think about our identities in a more abstract way, in a way that we can quantify. So when we think about our identity maps, we can consider those when we also interact with other people who have very different identity maps than ourselves. And using this knowledge of identities and how they impact us, we can use this to have more productive dialogue with other people. So I broke these productive dialogue steps into 5 distinct categories, all with an R in front of them. So the 5 R's here, which I'll go through: respect, relate, reframe, revise, and repeat. And these are based on social science that can guide us towards having more productive conversations, often using what we know about identities and identity theory. So what's been a common theme in this conference already is to establish respect for each other. So Amy in her keynote talked about benevolence. A lot of this connects to that. So we know through a lot of social science research that when people are feeling respected, they are more likely to avoid defensive biases. They're more satisfied with the conversation. They're less polarized. And they feel safer to have a dialogue with someone else. So when we think about this process of building mutual respect, listening is definitely an important component. And we can do this by seeking to understand, resisting the urge to judge other people, trying to be curious as we can, and then providing positive nonverbal and verbal feedback. So it's not just the connection that we have with someone, it really matters that the type of exposure we have with them, if it's a meaningful relationship or not. So there's research showing that if we have a superficial interaction with someone who thinks differently than us, this can actually increase polarization, such as interacting with someone on social media. But when we have meaningful social connections with someone who thinks differently than us, this can actually lead to a reduction in polarization, again, because of this baseline mutual respect and trust. So for example, children have been found to have an effective impact on changing their parents' minds about climate change attitudes. But again, it's really important to consider the mutual part of the mutual respect. So I really like this quote from Dr. Catherine Heo. She's a climate scientist. She talks to lots of different groups about climate change. And she talks about the importance of mutual respect. So it's not just, if someone's not giving you that respect back, then you might be better spending your time with someone else who does give you that respect. So it is really important to think of this two-way street with mutual respect. Okay, so we established mutual respect with the person we're talking to. Another strategy that can be useful to have more productive dialogue is to relate to a shared identity. So again, we talked about the power of identities. We can use that to improve our conversation. So there's research showing that if we highlight a common in-group identity, this can reduce division and bias. And people are more receptive to information from in-group members. So for example, there's research showing that Democrats and Republicans are less polarized when they focus on their common American identity before conversing with each other. There's also some interesting work that paired different people to talk about lots of apolitical topics, so music or sports or TV shows. And if they had common interests first, they then had less polarization when they started talking about politics because they bonded over that common interest, that common identity, before they went to an identity where they disagreed or had different approaches on. So another way to think about this are some tips I learned from this empathy workshop I went to by Dr. Ray McTuffie. She's a science communication researcher. So she talks about being engaging, not dismissive, and how we can reflect on a different point of view as well. So for example, you might not have religion in common with someone or your love of fishing with them, but maybe you both have children, and you can talk about your parent identity, and that could be a way to intersect. Additionally, when we're thinking about identities, when we related to a common identity, we can also think about reframing that conversation to address different people's concerns. So again, thinking about the audience is really important as well, which again is a common theme at this conference too. So I like this quote from Emily Calandrelli. She's also a science communicator who does a lot of really cool things. She's also an engineer. And I asked her, what's the #1 science communication strategy you can tell me? And as you can read up there, she says the most straightforward strategy is to talk about science in a way that interests your audience. So we all have our own interests on why we care about the thing we study, but it's really important to consider the other person's perspective as well. So this is really helpful when we want to have a productive conversation with someone, because not only can we get them to pay more attention to us, but they might be more open to our perspective as well. So there's research showing that liberals and conservatives tend to have different areas of emphasis for the values they have. So you can see them up there. Liberals care more about protection from harm and fairness. Conservatives care more about loyalty, respect, purity. Both groups care about liberty. So using this, there's research showing that conservatives are actually more likely to support pro-environmental legislation when it's framed in terms of purity rather than harm. Liberals, on the other side, are more likely to support military spending when it's framed in terms of how it can help lower-income people. So again, this is some research showing how thinking about values and audiences can be helpful. There's also some work that came out during COVID that conservative white evangelicals were more likely to support wearing masks when this mask use was supported by Republican Donald Trump, or when it was given a religious message about loving your neighbor. So again, this is reframing the conversation to the audience. So when we think about identities, we can think about connecting with an identity we share with someone, but also reframing it in a way that could connect to another person. So now we've related, we've reframed. Moving on to the fourth R, now we can really think about how we even share our questions and our arguments and our perspectives with another person in a way that's more productive. And one way is just to broadly encourage reflective thinking as best we can. So there's research showing when people are more analytical, they tend to be more open-minded, more open to changing their attitudes. And again, when people are reflecting on accuracy, being more analytical, they're less likely to share and believe fake news as well. So whenever people are even in a like-minded group where they all agree, if there's a moderator encouraging deliberation and thoughtfulness, this can still reduce polarization. And a lot of this goes back thousands of years with philosophy. When we think about the Socratic method and applied epistemology, we can ask people how confident they are, question how they know what they know. And that word how is really important because there's research showing that whenever you ask someone how they know something and you ask them to describe the step-by-step process of how they got to that conclusion, they're less polarized in their attitudes. And there's research showing that even when you talk about apolitical issues, they are going to give more evidence-based reasons than if you ask them why they believe something. Because if you ask someone why, they can give you a really short answer. I believe this because my favorite politician said so, or just because it's the way it is. But if you ask them how, it really forces them to think about that and go through that step-by-step process. And finally, the last step, the most simplest step, but also the most important here, repeat. So you have to keep doing this over and over again to have the best results. So there's research showing that you can teach people media literacy, you can have people depolarized through different education techniques, but these are short-lived interventions a lot of the time. You really need to keep doing it. And again, building relationships are key for this productive dialogue, so you can keep having those conversations over and over. But of course, this takes a lot of time and energy. And I've thought about a lot of these steps in my own life, and I've employed them in different interactions. And I can tell you that I've had the most success in person. So an online conversation with someone who you think differently about can be really challenging. I also want to say that the repeat step is so critical because there's been times where I've had a really productive conversation with someone who thinks differently than me. They seem to really understand where I'm coming from, then we won't talk about it for a few months, and then when we do talk about it again, it's like right where we started from. And I might be the only person in their social network that shares my attitudes, so they might not even get exposure to any other thoughts similar to mine until we have those conversations. So it's really important to repeat them. Other times, this can be challenging to develop meaningful relationships. For example, I've also done some scientific testimony where I've talked to different legislators and their staff. And this is challenging because oftentimes you just get a one-off situation where you go and talk to them or you talk to their staff member and you move on. And they might not listen to you as much if they don't know you. And also through